People, what is the most terrifying thing someone has confessed to you while drunk? This story wasn't shared over drinks, but I think it still fits. I volunteer at a nursing home, and one of the female residents, nearing the end of her life, confided something deeply personal to me. She revealed that, years ago, her husband had an affair with their neighbor's wife. When the neighbor's husband found out, he was furious and threatened to beat her husband badly. To avoid the confrontation, her husband and the neighbor struck a twisted deal. The neighbor agreed not to harm him if he was allowed to return the favor. In other words, her husband willingly offered her to the neighbor to save himself from a beating. What makes it even more heartbreaking is what happened afterward. She became pregnant, and though she told her husband for the rest of his life that the child was his, deep down, she always believed the child was the neighbor's. She carried that secret, and the pain of her husband's betrayal, for her entire life, feeling like she had been betrayed on every possible level, both with the cheating on her and with the trading her off like a cow. It was one of the most heartbreaking conversations I've ever had. Story 2. One night, a girl who had graduated the year before us got drunk and casually dropped a bombshell. She admitted she had been sleeping with one of our teachers. He wasn't just any teacher. He was the history teacher and the girls' flag football coach. We'd always kind of suspected something was off about him. Rumors had floated around for years, but we never had solid proof until that moment. He was a creepy, lazy excuse for a teacher, the kind who seemed more interested in chatting with students than actually teaching anything worthwhile. What made it even worse was that his wife was pregnant with their second child during the time this was happening. To make matters more unsettling, it didn't seem like this girl was the only one. A lot of the flag football players would hang out in his classroom whenever they wanted, raising even more eyebrows. The whole thing was disgusting, and hearing her confession just confirmed what so many of us had suspected all along, that he was crossing lines he never should have. Story 3. My parents recently admitted that they had another child who passed away before my twin sister and I were born. At first, the revelation itself wasn't all that terrifying, as I understand that these things can happen. What truly shook me, though, was the fact that my sister and I always knew about him. Yet for our entire lives, our parents convinced us that we were misremembering. We're not sure how we knew. Our brother died a year before we were born, and we've never met him. There are no photos of him, and his existence was never mentioned. Our parents, along with the rest of the family, seemed to completely erase him. This was, unfortunately, in line with how our family operates. If they don't want to acknowledge something, they just shut it out entirely. But somehow, from a very young age, my sister and I both clearly remembered having a brother. We would tell everyone we had one, and many of our school friends knew about him. When it was revealed that it was just the two of us, our friends called us liars, but we were just genuinely confused because we knew it was true. Over the years, we confronted our parents repeatedly. Every time, they denied it. They swore up and down that we had no other siblings and insisted we were simply confused. Then, one day when they were both drunk, we overheard them talking about him. We ran downstairs to confront them, and that was when they finally admitted it. Even now, we don't know how we knew. Perhaps we must have heard something when we were very little, but it's disturbing to think that our entire family lied to us for 16 years. We even remembered his name. The most unsettling thing, though, is that both my sister and I still have this gut feeling they're lying. We both have a clear memory of playing with a slightly older boy when we were very young, and in that memory, we both distinctly thought of him as our older brother. It feels impossible to ignore, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story than what we're being told. Story 4. One night, I was at a bar in an affluent town when an older man next to me started sharing stories from his sailing days. He told me he used to own a 60-foot sailboat and had sailed extensively throughout North and South America. One of his stories, from the mid-1980s, left a lasting impression. He recounted anchoring near an island off the coast of Venezuela one evening with his girlfriend. They had just fallen asleep when he heard a bump against the boat. At first, he thought little of it, barely registering the sound, but something told him to check it out. As he climbed out of the sleeping berth, he passed the steep stairs leading from the cabin to the aft deck. Like most sailboats, the stairs were narrow and vertical, and he always kept a pistol holstered on the side of the stair rail for emergencies. On a whim, he grabbed the pistol as he ascended. When he was about halfway onto the deck, he saw a man climbing over the railing. The intruder was armed with an automatic weapon, possibly an AR-15 or something similar. Reacting instantly, the sailor fired 2 shots, hitting the man, who tumbled back over the railing. Rushing to the side of the boat, the sailor looked down and saw another man armed with an assault rifle in a smaller boat below. Without hesitation, he shot the second man as well. Realizing the danger they were in, He quickly pulled up anchor and left the area, navigating away under the cover of night. He explained that pirate activity wasn't uncommon in those waters at the time. Pirates would often board boats, tie up the occupants, loot everything, and then set the boat on fire, with the victims still aboard. The bump he had heard earlier was the pirate's boat coming alongside his. That incident, he said, was enough to end his visits to South America for good. Story 5. During my freshman year of college, I made a lot of new friends, but one guy stood out. He was the classic goofball, laid back, always up for anything, and the life of the party. But there was one major red flag. Whenever we were drinking and hanging out, he would always push himself to the point of blacking out. He drank way too much and would end up stumbling around the party like a spaghetti noodle, barely coherent. One night, after a party had died down and a few of us were still hanging out, we decided to ask him why he always drank so hard. He was visibly drunk, slurring his words, and struggling to keep his head up as he answered. What he told us left all of us stunned. He said that just a few months earlier, the summer before college started, his best friend had called him one evening. They lived in a small beach town, and his friend had asked him to come watch the sunset by the water. He biked over, and they sat together, talking for a while. Everything seemed normal, until his friend suddenly pulled out a pistol and offed himself. He had to call the police, completely in shock, while covered in his friend's remains. Just weeks later, he packed up and left for college, still traumatized and unable to process what had happened. He admitted that he hadn't been able to sleep, focus, or even feel normal since that night. The next morning, he didn't remember telling us that story, and none of us wanted to bring it up again. His drinking didn't change much throughout college. He continued to push himself to the edge at every party. It wasn't until senior year, right before graduation, that he finally started going to therapy. After graduating, he got a job and began turning things around. From what I've heard, he's doing much better now, and I'm so thankful he's managed to start healing. It's a reminder of how much pain people can carry beneath the surface, even when they're the loudest, funniest person in the room. Story 6. A gay man dying of AIDS once offered to let me charge my entire bar tab to his credit card because, as he put it, he wasn't going to live much longer. At the time, it was me and a few friends watching football, and our tab probably totaled over $200. But before he made the offer, I'd been talking with him for a while. He seemed lonely and scared, like he just needed someone to sit with him and treat him like a person, not an outsider. So instead of focusing on the offer, we stayed and watched football with him for the rest of the afternoon. We made him feel welcome, normal, and part of the group, at least for those few hours. He was just like the rest of us in what he wanted, to not feel alone and to know someone cared. I believe his name was Ron. This happened back in 2001, and it's stuck with me ever since. Story 7. One night, while my dad was drunk, he let something slip that completely shattered my understanding of my family. He told me the real reason he and my mom divorced. It wasn't the irreconcilable differences or drifting apart they had always vaguely mentioned. It was because my mom had slept with his best friend. To make matters even more complicated, that man is now my stepdad, and together they had my younger brother. Hearing those words felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I nearly fainted, overwhelmed by the weight of what I'd just learned. For the past 20 years, I'd been living with a completely fabricated version of events, having no clue about the betrayal and drama that had unfolded before I was old enough to understand. Story 8. I have a friend who's always been known for his love of drinking. He enjoys himself, but he's careful to avoid crossing a certain line because when he does, he becomes extremely talkative, spilling more than he probably should. One thing about him that's always puzzled us is that he never dates, ever. He's a good-looking guy, genuinely kind, fun to be around, when sober, but he just avoids relationships altogether. For the longest time, we didn't understand why. Then, one night, he got absolutely hammered, and I finally found out the reason. While slurring his words and opening up in a way he never had before, he told me something deeply unsettling. When he was a kid, he witnessed his aunt off his uncle in cold blood. The trauma of that event left him profoundly shaken, especially when it came to his trust in women. He admitted that ever since, he's been terrified of being alone with a woman, unable to shake the feeling that he could never truly feel safe in that situation. Hearing his story completely changed the way I saw him. What I'd always brushed off as just a quirk, his avoidance of dating, was actually rooted in something unimaginably dark and tragic. Story 9. One night at a bar, I noticed two friends of mine, a guy and a girl, sitting outside in the patio area. They both looked visibly upset, so I walked over to check on them. I asked if they were okay, and the guy immediately responded, "Nah, but I can't talk to you about it." Respecting his boundaries, I just said, "All right, let me know if you ever want to. Love you guys." But then, as I turned to leave, he stopped me and said, "Actually, come back here. You're good." What followed completely caught me off guard. They both started opening up about deeply personal and traumatic experiences. He told me he had been SA'd by his uncle, and she revealed that her cousin had done the same to her. For him, I was the first guy he had ever confided in about it, and she admitted she'd only ever shared her story with a couple of people outside of her therapist. I wasn't particularly close with either of them, at least not on that level, so I was genuinely shocked that they felt comfortable enough to share something so heavy with me. I just listened, doing my best to be supportive in the moment. To this day, I'm not sure if either of them even remembers that conversation, but it stuck with me. It was a reminder of how much pain people can carry silently and how important it is to just be present when someone needs to talk, even if you're caught completely off guard. Story 10. My grandpa rarely, if ever, talked about his time serving in the Korean War. It was clear he carried a heavy burden, though. He suffered from severe PTSD, often waking up in the middle of the night screaming. We all knew something terrible had happened, but he never shared the details. One night, however, he came home completely drunk, collapsed onto the couch, and opened up in a way he never had before. He told me that his entire unit had been wiped out right in front of him. He was the only survivor. As their sergeant, he was responsible for them, and he carried the weight of that guilt every day. To make matters worse, after witnessing their deaths, he found himself trapped behind enemy lines, but somehow managed to make it out alive. That one drunken confession gave me a glimpse into the unimaginable trauma he had endured and why he blamed himself, even though it was clear it wasn't his fault. It wasn't until his 60s that he finally sought help through veterans therapy, and it seemed to bring him some relief, though the scars never fully faded. His story has always stayed with me, a reminder of the silent battles so many veterans continue to fight long after the war is over. Story 11. About 6 months ago, my brother and I decided to spend the weekend getting drunk and playing video games, just blowing off steam. We were deep into the night, plenty of shots, drinks, and laughs. We were completely wrecked but having a blast, diving into some old-school World at War zombies for nostalgia. At one point, we paused the game to grab snacks, and as I was reaching for the salsa, my brother hit me with something I wasn't prepared for. Out of the blue, he told me he had tried to take off himself about a month earlier. He had taken pills, ended up in the hospital, and had his stomach pumped. He said that while he was lying there, all he could think about was me, how devastated and depressed I'd be if he were gone, and that thought stopped him from going through with it again. Hearing that floored me, and I felt like I had to share something too. I told him I had also tried to do the same some time ago, and the only thing that kept me from going through with it was the thought of him and how much it would hurt him. We sat there for a while, just talking about everything. Our struggles, fears, and how much we meant to each other. It was the deepest conversation we'd ever had, and it didn't feel heavy. It felt like healing. After that, we went back to playing zombies, but something had changed. Since that night, we've made a promise to each other. We talk every single day, without fail, and I know we'll never miss a day. Both of us are in therapy now, working on getting better, and it's amazing to have someone to trust and lean on. I'll always be grateful for that night, for the honesty, the bond we deepened, and the chance to fight through this together. Story 12. One night, I was drinking with an old acquaintance, a 49-year-old woman, and we ended up staying up late. She drank much faster than I did, and eventually, she drunkenly confided in me something I wasn't prepared for. She told me that when her aging, sick mother, whom she had always despised and who had become a huge burden to care for, was left in her care, she deliberately withheld certain medications and over-medicated her with others, planning to hasten her passing. It worked. Afterward, she told her other siblings that their mother's illness had simply taken its toll and that she passed peacefully in her sleep. Since their mother was already old and sick, there was no autopsy. A minute later, she snapped back to reality, realizing what she had just said, and apologized profusely. She admitted that I was the only person she had ever told this to, and she seemed genuinely remorseful for sharing such a dark secret. Story 13. My ex in college once told me something while blackout drunk, and it still haunts me to this day. He said that a few years before, he and a group of other kids had broken into an empty house to throw a party. The family who lived there was away on vacation or something. I'm not sure how they picked the house or knew it would be empty. It's been over a decade, and I've forgotten some details. They got drunk, and someone decided to start by breaking a picture on the wall. Then someone else joined in, and before they knew it, the situation had completely spiraled. They ended up destroying everything they could. Every window was shattered. They broke the legs off all the chairs and used them to smash holes in the walls. They ripped up or stole clothing, burned or destroyed all the family photos, and pretty much ruined anything they could get their hands on. I don't remember all the details, but I'll never forget him crying as he told me about it. He said that they ruined those people's lives, and there was no way to make it right. I honestly think he was so drunk that he didn't even remember telling me, because we never spoke about it again after that night. A couple of years later, he punched me in the face for asking for a ride to work one too many times. So, I guess no matter the situation or how much he'd been drinking, he was a piece of turd. Story 14. I had a friend who told me that his girlfriend broke up with him after a huge fight when they were both drunk. She was convinced that he had threatened her with physical violence, but he insisted that he was just venting out of frustration, sitting the whole time, while she was the one yelling and screaming. It sounded odd, but I didn't think much of it at first. A few weeks later, we went out for drinks, and he ended up completely plastered. I helped walk him back to his place, along with one of his other friends. On the way, he suddenly broke down in tears, saying he'd messed up and that he was a terrible person. We asked him what happened, and that's when he confessed. He told us that his ex had left him because he had thrown her into a mirror and flipped the coffee table at her. She was okay, just a couple of bruises and scrapes. After hearing that, I kept my distance from him. Story 15. I was at home one night when a friend of mine came over, clearly intoxicated. She stumbled in and plopped down on the couch a few feet from me, looking lost in thought. Then, out of nowhere, she started sharing something with me that I wasn't prepared for. She took a shaky breath and began, "When I was 19, my stepdad got really drunk and tried to force me. He said I reminded him so much of his late wife, Abigail, that he couldn't help himself. He kept calling me her name, telling me how much he missed her and loved her, but that she was gone forever. He wouldn't stop, and he just kept saying that I looked like her, and that's why he couldn't control what he was doing." She paused, wiping away a few tears before continuing. "That's why I don't talk about anything related to that stuff with you guys. I lost my V card to someone out of pity and guilt, and it has left me with so much emotional and mental hurt that I can't even begin to explain." At this point, I was just frozen. I didn't know how to react. She started crying harder, and I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, listening, trying to process it all. It wasn't until a few moments later that I realized why she's so closed off about her family. She'd always avoided talking about her stepdad when we'd asked about her parents. She then told me that I was the only one she had ever told about what happened, that I was the only one who knew. I didn't know how to comfort her, but I knew in that moment just how much pain she was carrying, silently, all this time. I wish I had known earlier so I could have been there for her, but I promised her that no matter what, I'd always listen, and I'd be there when she needed someone. Story 16. The Christmas party started out just like any other, lively, festive, and full of holiday cheer. Everyone was enjoying themselves, mingling and laughing, when suddenly, everything took a turn. A middle-aged couple, who had been drinking a little too much, began to argue. What began as a simple disagreement quickly escalated into an all-out shouting match, just a few minutes before midnight. The wife wasn't a co-worker, but her husband was. They were both clearly intoxicated, and the situation got uncomfortable very fast. People tried to intervene, but it only seemed to make things worse. I stepped in, offering to escort the husband into the cloakroom to help him cool down and give him some space. As we stepped into the quieter room, I expected him to vent about the argument or even to apologize, but what came next completely caught me off guard. This man, known around the office for being a cocky, self-proclaimed Tinder hustler, started to sob. I'd heard him brag about his affairs before. His extramarital exploits were no secret, but I wasn't prepared for him to open up like this. Through tears and shaky breaths, he confessed, "I've made so many mistakes. I've been unfaithful to her for years." He continued, voice breaking. "But that's not even the worst part. I tested positive for HIV 6 months ago." My stomach sank. He went on to say that he'd kept this from his wife and everyone else, and now he was terrified that she was going to leave him. It seemed like he was expecting some kind of sympathy, but all I could feel was the weight of his words. He continued sobbing, asking how he could make things right, still seeing himself as the victim in all of this. It was a difficult moment to process. Here was this man, who had built a reputation around his infidelities, now desperate and vulnerable, facing the consequences of his actions. His life was unraveling, and despite the mess he'd created, he seemed to think that his wife's departure was somehow unfair. Story 17. He told me, in a drunken stupor, that he had been sleeping with another woman while my sister was pregnant with his child. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he tried to kiss me right after admitting it. I know he was intoxicated, but that's no excuse. Naturally, I immediately told my sister what had happened. His reaction was completely over the top. He got furious and, in an attempt to shift the blame, told her that he and I had been having an affair, which was absolutely ridiculous and a blatant lie. The man is a decade older than me, yet he acted like an immature teenager throughout the whole ordeal. He didn't want my sister to have a relationship with me anymore because I exposed the truth. It's amazing how people who cheat think they can manipulate the situation to avoid accountability. If you're in a relationship, be honest. Cheating destroys trust and hurts everyone involved. It's a mess that doesn't just affect the people directly involved. It screws people up. Story 18. I was invited over to a coworker's place to hang out, but by the time I arrived, he was already completely hammered, shirtless, and rambling. It was only 2 p.m. on a Monday. Not sure how to get out of the situation, I followed him inside, hoping maybe he'd calm down, clean up, or at least pour some coffee to sober up. But instead, he just kept drinking and started going on about how much of a piece of shit he is. His words. He went into detail about his criminal record, all the messed up things he thought were acceptable in his past, and how he was facing court over threats against former employers. His behavior started getting more erratic, and I started feeling really unsafe. After a while, I tried to figure out how to leave without making him angry or upsetting him further. I ended up faking a phone call and used that as my excuse to leave after about an hour. Honestly, most of that time was spent feeling genuinely afraid of what might happen. I've seen firsthand what people in that state are capable of, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Story 19. The first story that comes to mind is about my ex's uncle. He came over for Easter dinner with both of our families. The meal went smoothly at first, but as the afternoon wore on, he started getting progressively more drunk. Eventually, everyone except for him left, and he was absolutely hammered. He started crying and opened up about how guilty he felt for his dad, who had just been moved into a pretty rough nursing home. Then, he dropped a bombshell. He told us that his mom had been cheating on his dad throughout his entire childhood, with his own brother. That's right. Uncle Bob would come over right after his dad left for work in the mornings and disappear into the bedroom with their mom for a while. Bonus story. After this, they moved their mom into an assisted living facility, and when they were packing up the family home, they found several hidden spots filled with liquor bottles. Apparently, Mom had been hiding a serious drinking problem from her husband all those years. Story 20. I was at a new adult summer camp with a fun, relaxed vibe, costumes, games, and plenty of good energy. The night ended with a late-night chill session where most of us were strangers, just sitting around, gazing at the stars, and knocking back beers. It was a carefree, open environment, and everyone was having a blast. At some point, one of the guys casually mentioned that he had married two of his friends, which wasn't too shocking because some of us had also been involved in similar situations. But then, with this eerie calmness, he dropped a bombshell. He nonchalantly said that the night before his wedding, he had slept with the bride, while his best friend, the groom, was passed out drunk in the same room. The entire group went silent for a moment, just trying to process what we'd heard. I was so stunned, I couldn't help but say, "You're a bad person." He shrugged it off and said that the bride was drunk and willing, and that was all that mattered to him. I was floored by how casually he spoke about completely betraying his best friend, and I couldn't help but wonder if the bride even knew who she had slept with. That was the moment I decided I couldn't associate with this guy anymore. I made sure to stay in touch with everyone else I met that weekend, but I kept my distance from him. That level of indifference to someone else's pain was unsettling, to say the least. Story 21. My first roommate in college had a rough night after his girlfriend broke up with him. He got really drunk, and I had to help him get into bed. While he was in that state, he shared with me that during a past incident when his girlfriend was sick and on medication, he had done something extremely disturbing while she was unconscious. He also mentioned it had happened when I was sleeping in the room, only a few feet away. I felt horrified and devastated. A couple of weeks later, I happened to see his ex-girlfriend on campus, and I decided to talk to her. I explained how I felt about what he had told me. It wasn't easy, but I felt she deserved to know. She reassured me that she didn't hold me accountable for what had happened, but I offered to testify in case she decided to report it. She was incredibly understanding. My roommate ended up leaving the university at the end of the semester, and I did report what he had confessed to me. He denied everything, claiming that he was drunk and that I somehow pressured him into sharing those details. It was a stressful time, and during the whole ordeal, I ended up switching roommates because of the tension. He became passive-aggressive toward me, making things difficult. It still weighs on me a little. I wish I had been more alert that night so I could have heard and possibly intervened, but I've tried to remind myself that I couldn't have known what was happening. The guilt is still there, but I've tried to come to terms with it. Years later, I received an invitation to her wedding, and we caught up. Her husband and I ended up becoming friends, as we had similar schedules and would often talk after class. Story 22. One night at a graduation party, I was spending time with a longtime friend, and we both ended up drinking a lot. In the middle of our conversation, he revealed something that completely shook me. He told me that during a previous gathering, he and his friends had taken advantage of me while I was unconscious. His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and in that moment, I sobered up instantly. I needed to understand exactly what he meant, so I asked him to clarify. He explained that I had passed out that night, and he and the others had decided to experiment in a way that completely violated my trust and bodily autonomy. He spoke about it so casually, as if he didn't fully grasp the harm he had caused, but I was horrified. After that conversation, I cut all ties with him. It was clear that I couldn't have someone like that in my life. What hurt even more was discovering later that many people I went to school with had known about what happened but never told me. It seemed like they had just let me believe that night was a blur, something I had pushed so far out of my mind that I convinced myself it wasn't real. But when he admitted it, the truth came crashing down. That moment shattered my sense of trust and security. It's something I'm still trying to process. Story 23. A few years ago, my neighbor came over to my apartment and asked if I'd like to do a shot with him to celebrate his birthday. He mentioned that all his friends were unavailable, and even though I was working a third shift that night to rearrange the store, I figured I could spare a few hours and be a good neighbor. I had about 4 or 5 hours before I needed to get to work, so I agreed. After the first shot, he offered me another. He was already fairly intoxicated, but I still felt like I should be friendly and didn't think much of it. He invited me inside and, with some pride, showed me a couch he had just bought. He told me how expensive it was and insisted I sit on it to see how luxurious it felt. Then, as I was sitting down, he suddenly jumped up and rushed over to the couch. He dug between the cushions and pulled something out, quickly moving it to the kitchen and shoving it into a cabinet over the stove. "Did you see what that was?" he asked, still a little wobbly, but trying to act casual. It seemed like a gun, so I said, "Looked like maybe a .45, with a shrug. He laughed, "Good eye." Then, he went on to tell me that people were after him, mentioning that he had just gotten out of prison. He showed me his remaining grow operation gear in his bedroom as we continued drinking and talked about how he turned on some people. By this point, his speech was slurred, and he was starting to get more unbalanced. I stayed calm, which is usually my default, but internally I was thinking, should I be leaving? But if I do, will he be offended? What could happen if he gets upset? And he's literally right next door. At some point, we ended up sitting on the steps outside our building, and I realized I had to get to work soon. I went back to my apartment, picked up my phone, and called my best friend. I told her I didn't think I should drive myself, as I was definitely feeling off after all the drinking. She came to pick me up, and when she arrived, she found me struggling to stay steady. I broke down in the car, upset over some recent personal trauma, and sobbed while she tried to comfort me on the way to work. I arrived at work, trying my best not to appear drunk as my manager gave me instructions for the night. I could tell he was looking at me carefully, and I was doing everything I could to hold it together. I never stopped feeling uneasy about that neighbor, even after he moved away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have tried something like that again, and his unpredictable behavior always left me on edge. Eventually, I moved to another town and then another state, partly to get away from that situation. Then, at my next apartment, my new neighbor invited me over for a drink. We were chatting for a while, but the conversation took an uncomfortable turn when he said something along the lines of, "Yeah, but don't you ever just want to feel another man's meat in your hands?" I told him, "Nah, but that's cool," trying to brush it off. He didn't take the hint, though, and kept pressing the issue despite my clear response. I kept changing the subject, but he wasn't letting it go. So, I texted my friend and asked her to call me as a pretext to leave. It was a strange and unsettling experience, and I'm just glad I was able to remove myself from both situations without anything escalating further. Story 24. My ex once confided in me about his past, and what he shared left me feeling deeply unsettled. He admitted that he had been a massive bully growing up, and that he had tormented one boy to the point where the boy eventually took his own life. From what he told me, the boy had been bullied by many others, but my ex went even further. He would pretend to be kind and act as though they were friends, only to turn around and subject the boy to even worse bullying, using the pretense of friendship to hurt him more deeply. What struck me the most was his guilt. It wasn't the kind of guilt you'd expect, one that was focused on the boy and the pain he had caused. Instead, his guilt seemed oddly self-centered. He wasn't remorseful about the boy's suffering. It was more about how his actions had affected his own image. It was as if he felt guilty not because of the harm he had caused, but because it conflicted with the persona he had worked so hard to build for himself. He went on to tell me that everything about his outward personality, the kindness, generosity, and thoughtfulness, was all an act. It was all carefully constructed so that people would view him in a certain light, to make him appear better than he truly was. He said that he didn't actually mean any of it. It was just a facade designed to hide who he really was deep down. At the time, I started to question our relationship. The cracks in his behavior were becoming more and more obvious, and his lack of genuine care or empathy for others was starting to seep through. I felt like I was seeing him for who he truly was, and it was terrifying. Eventually, everything he had shown me made sense when I learned that he was emotionally abusive and likely a sociopath. His manipulative and callous nature, the way he used people to serve his own needs, and his total disregard for the feelings of others, it all clicked. I began to see that the man I had been with was nothing like the person he had presented to the world, and it left me shaken. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.